You are too loud. My finger was pressed against the center of his chest before my brain could catch up with my hand. Kieran Blackwood, the Alpha of the North, the man who snapped bones like dry twigs, froze mid-shout. The entire great hall went so still I could hear the dust settling. His eyes, burning like molten gold, dropped to my shaking finger, then snapped up to my face. He didn't rip my throat out. He didn't command his guards to drag me away. He smiled. It was a dark, terrifying curve of his lips that promised absolute chaos. He leaned down until his nose brushed mine, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into my marrow. Make me. Welcome back, my loves, to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. If you are ready to find out exactly what happens when a healer challenges a king, you are in the right place. Before we let the sparks fly, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a chapter of this romance. If you want to support the channel even more and get early access to these stories, consider joining our channel membership. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from today? I love seeing our pack grow across the globe. Now, take a deep breath. Let's step into the infirmary. Chapter 1. The Day I Silenced the Storm. The walls of the infirmary were vibrating again. It wasn't an earthquake, and it wasn't the rumble of a distant storm rolling over the mountains. It was Kieran Blackwood. The alpha of the Crestwood pack was currently standing in the hallway just outside my sanctuary, tearing a strip off his beta, Jax, with a voice that sounded like boulders grinding together. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to focus on the suturing needle in my hand. But the sheer volume of his displeasure was making the delicate silver instrument tremble. My patient, a young wolf named Toby, who had taken a tumble during training, looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, his ears flattened against his skull in submission to a dominance that wasn't even directed at him. That was the problem with Kieran. He didn't just command a room, he consumed it. He was a gravitational force of pure, unbridled noise and power, and I had been nursing a migraine for 3 days straight. I tried to breathe through the irritation, inhaling the clean, sharp scent of antiseptic and dried chamomile that usually calmed me. It didn't work. The shouting escalated, a baritone roar that rattled the glass jars on my shelves. My hand slipped, just a fraction, and Toby flinched. That was it. The snap of my patience was louder in my own ears than any growl could ever be. I set the needle down on the metal tray with a deliberate clatter, peeled off my latex gloves, and marched toward the double doors. My wolf, usually a timid creature who preferred the shadows, was pacing anxiously in my chest, screaming at me to stop, to hide, to submit. I ignored her. I ignored common sense. I was a healer, running on caffeine and spite, and I was going to get some quiet, even if I had to sedate the Alpha King himself to get it. I threw the doors open, and the heavy wood slammed against the hallway walls. The sound cut through the argument like a gunshot. Kieran was standing with his back to me, his massive frame blocking out the light from the hallway fixtures. He was terrifying, a wall of muscle and tension, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the entire territory. Jax looked past him, saw me, and his eyes widened in a silent plea for mercy, or perhaps a eulogy. Kieran turned slowly, the movement predatory and smooth, his conversation with Jax forgotten. He looked at me, his golden eyes narrowing, expecting an apology or a bowing head. He expected fear. Instead, I marched right up into his personal space, invading the invisible boundary that every wolf knew never to cross. I didn't stop until I was close enough to feel the heat radiating off him, a furnace burning beneath a tailored black shirt. I reached out and pressed my index finger firmly into the center of his chest. It was like poking a marble statue, unyielding and hard. But I didn't pull back. I glared up at him, craning my neck to meet a gaze that had brought grown men to their knees. "You," I said, my voice shaking not with fear, but with the adrenaline of my own stupidity, "are too loud. This is a place of healing, Kieran. It is a place for rest. If you want to bark orders, go do it on the mountain. But while you are in my hallway, you will be quiet." The silence that followed was heavy, thick enough to choke on. Jax looked like he was about to faint. The few other wolves lingering in the corridor had frozen in place, staring at me as if I were a ghost. I waited for the explosion. I waited for the alpha command that would force me to my knees, for the anger that would surely follow such public disrespect. But the explosion didn't come. Kieran stared down at me, his expression unreadable, his gaze dropping to where my finger still rested against his chest. Slowly, terrifyingly, the corner of his mouth ticked up. It wasn't a kind smile. It was a dark, wicked curve that promised trouble. He took a step closer, forcing me to tilt my head back even further, eliminating the sliver of air between our bodies. The scent of him washed over me, rich sandalwood and wood smoke, intoxicating and overwhelming. He didn't smell like anger. He smelled like interest. He raised a hand, his large palm hovering near my face, before his thumb grazed my jawline, a touch so light it felt like a brand. His golden eyes locked onto mine, burning with a sudden intense heat that made my knees weak. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of my ear, his voice dropping to a low, rough rumble that vibrated through my entire skeleton. "You want me to be quiet, little healer?" he whispered, the sound dark and taunting, wrapping around my senses like smoke. "Make me." Chapter 2. The Wolf at the Door. The only thing more terrifying than a shouting alpha is a silent one, and Kieran Blackwood had decided to become the quietest predator in existence. After he whispered that impossible challenge in the hallway, he didn't wait for an answer. He simply straightened his jacket, gave me one last lingering look that felt like a caress, and walked away, leaving me trembling in the middle of the corridor, with my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had retreated to the safety of the infirmary immediately, convincing myself that I had hallucinated the heat in his eyes. I told myself that by morning he would forget the healer who dared to hush him, and go back to barking orders from his office on the top floor. I was wrong. I was catastrophically, desperately wrong. The next morning began with a deceptive calm. I arrived early, hoping to organize the inventory before the daily rush of training injuries, but the moment I unlocked the main doors, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The infirmary was empty, yet the air felt charged, heavy with a presence I couldn't see but could instinctively feel. I turned toward the corner office I used for consultations, and there he was. Kieran wasn't sitting behind my desk, thankfully, but he was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over that expansive chest, looking entirely too comfortable in a room meant for sterile procedures and quiet recovery. He was wearing a dark grey shirt that strained across his shoulders, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. And he was watching me with that same unnerving golden focus. He didn't say a word. He just watched me hang up my coat, his gaze tracking the movement of my hands as if it were the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. I tried to ignore him. I tried to bury myself in the routine of my work, checking expiration dates on salves and restocking bandages. But it was impossible to focus when the alpha of the pack was looming in my peripheral vision like a mountain range. Every time I moved, his eyes followed. When I reached for a jar on a high shelf, I heard his breath hitch slightly. A sound so soft I might have imagined it, but it sent a shiver racing down my spine. The worst part was the silence. He was adhering to my demand with malicious compliance. He didn't speak to the betas who came in with bruised ribs. He simply nodded at them, a silent dismissal that sent them scurrying away faster than any shout could have. He was weaponizing the quiet I had asked for, turning it into a heavy, intimate blanket that wrapped around us, isolating me with him even in a room full of people. By midday, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I dropped a roll of gauze for the third time, and before I could bend down to retrieve it, Kieran was there. He moved with a speed that defied physics, crouching down to snatch the roll from the floor. He didn't hand it back immediately. He stood slowly, towering over me, forcing me to tilt my head back to look him in the eye. He held the gauze out, his fingers brushing against mine as I took it, a spark of static electricity snapping between us that made me gasp. He didn't pull away. He stayed there, invading my personal space, smelling of rain and deep, earthy forests, creating a sensory overload that made my knees feel like water. I clutched the gauze to my chest like a shield, my breath catching in my throat. "You need to leave," I managed to say, though my voice lacked the steel I had possessed yesterday. It sounded breathless, traitorous. "You are scaring the patients, Kieran. You're hovering. This is a medical facility, not a spectator sport. Unless you are bleeding, broken, or dying, you are violating the sterile field, and I am officially kicking you out." I pointed toward the double doors, trying to summon the authority of my station, trying to remind him, and myself, that in this room, the healer outranked the wolf. Kieran didn't even glance at the door. He looked at my shaking finger, then back to my face, his expression shifting from predatory intensity to a mocking, devastating charm. He stepped past me, walking deeper into the room, and hopped effortlessly onto the primary examination table. The metal groaned under his weight as he settled himself, legs dangling over the edge, looking for all the world like a king on a throne rather than a patient in a clinic. He leaned back, supporting his weight on his hands, his shirt stretching tight across his chest, and gave me a look that was pure, unfiltered challenge. "I can't leave, Mara," he said, his voice a rough velvet slide that made my toes curl in my shoes. "I'm feeling incredibly unwell. My heart rate is erratic, my temperature is rising, and I can't seem to focus on anything. I think I have a fever. You better check me, healer, thoroughly." Chapter 3. Skin to Skin. The examination room felt suddenly smaller, the air sucked out by Kieran's casual, devastating declaration. He sat on the exam table, legs spread comfortably, looking not in the least bit sick. If anything, he radiated vitality, a raw, masculine energy that made the sterile white walls seem fragile. I stood frozen, clutching my clipboard like a lifeline, my mind racing through professional protocols while my body reacted with treacherous heat. I knew what he was doing. This was a game, a continuation of the challenge I had so recklessly issued in the hallway. He wanted to see if I would fold, if the healer who dared to silence him would crumble when faced with his physical proximity. I took a steadying breath, forced my shoulders down, and decided that if he wanted to play patient, I would play doctor. And I would be the most professional, detached doctor he had ever met. Fine, I said, my voice clipped and efficient. I set the clipboard down on the counter and grabbed my stethoscope, turning back to him with a mask of clinical indifference. If you're symptomatic, we'll do a full vitals check. Sit up straight. Kieran smirked, a slow, lazy tilting of his lips, but he obeyed. He sat up, and as I stepped between his spread knees, the reality of his size hit me. He was massive. Even sitting, he was nearly eye level with me. The heat coming off him was palpable, a physical wave of warmth that made my own skin prickle. I reached out to unbutton the top of his shirt, my fingers brushing the hard plane of his collarbone, and I felt a tremor run through him. Not of fever, but of tension. I slid the stethoscope earpieces into my ears, blocking out the ambient noise of the infirmary, leaving only the sound of my own quickening breath. I placed the cold metal disc against the warm skin of his chest, just over his heart. The rhythm that greeted me was strong, steady, and powerful. Thump, 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 thump. It wasn't the racing, erratic beat of illness. It was the calm, assured engine of an apex predator. I moved the disc slightly, frowning in concentration, trying to find any irregularity to justify his claim. As I leaned closer, my hair fell forward, brushing against his shoulder. His scent, that deep, addictive mix of sandalwood and wood smoke, filled my nose, making my head spin. Breathe in, I instructed softly, keeping my eyes fixed on the buttons of his shirt to avoid his gaze. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding against my hand, the movement slow and deliberate. I moved the stethoscope again, focusing on his lungs. But my focus was shattering. Being this close to him wasn't just distracting, it was overwhelming. I could see the pulse beating at the base of his throat, the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his golden eyes were tracking every micro movement of my face. I pulled back slightly to check his temperature, reaching for the digital thermometer, but before I could grab it, his hand shot out. His fingers wrapped around my wrist, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to hold me in place. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure energy zapped from his skin to mine, racing up my arm and settling heavy and hot in my stomach. I froze, looking down at his large hand engulfing my wrist. His thumb swept slowly over the sensitive skin of my inner arm, right over my own racing pulse. It was a possessive, intimate gesture that had nothing to do with medicine. I looked up, finally meeting his eyes. The playfulness was gone. His gaze was dark, heavy with a hunger that stole the air from my lungs. "Your heart rate is normal, Kieran," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Your respiration is clear. You don't have a fever." I tried to pull my hand back, but he didn't let go. He held me there, his thumb continuing that hypnotic, maddening stroke against my skin. "Check again," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that I felt more than heard. He guided my hand back to his chest, pressing my palm flat directly over his heart. The moment my skin touched his, the rhythm beneath my palm changed. It spiked. The steady, powerful beat accelerated, pounding hard and fast against his ribs, a frantic, thunderous rhythm that mirrored my own. His eyes searched mine, raw and unguarded for the first time. He wasn't playing anymore. He leaned forward, bringing his face so close I could feel the warmth of his breath on my lips. "See?" he rasps, tightening his grip on my wrist just enough to keep my hand pressed to the source of his chaos. "I told you I was sick, Mara. But it seems the only medicine that works is you. Your hands are the only quiet thing in this entire house." Chapter 4. Scent of a King. The black leather jacket sat on the back of my office chair like a brooding gargoyle, dominating the room with a presence that was almost as heavy as the man who owned it. Kieran had left it behind after his examination yesterday. A calculated oversight that I knew was no accident. For hours I had tried to ignore it, but the garment seemed to have its own gravitational pull. Every time the air conditioner kicked on, the scent of sandalwood and wood smoke wafted across the room, wrapping around me, distracting me from my charts, and making my wolf pace restlessly in my chest. It was a scent that spoke of deep forests and power, a scent that triggered a confusing mix of anxiety and safety. By the time my shift ended, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the jacket, intending to march straight to the Alpha's wing and return his property, thereby removing his phantom presence from my workspace. I found him in the courtyard, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the stone pavers. He was speaking with two of his sentinels, his posture relaxed but commanding. Yet the moment I stepped outside, his head snapped toward me. It was instantaneous, as if he had felt the vibration of my footsteps through the earth. I marched up to him, the heavy leather bundled in my arms, feeling the eyes of the sentinels burning into me. I thrust the jacket toward him, holding it like it was radioactive material. "You left this," I said, my voice tight. "In the infirmary. I thought you might need it back, considering it's going to be a cold night." Kieran didn't reach for it. He looked at the jacket, then at me, his gaze traveling slowly down my shivering form. I hadn't brought my own coat, and the mountain air was biting, raising gooseflesh on my bare arms. A slow, knowing smirk touched his lips. "I didn't forget it, Mara," he said, his voice smooth and carrying effortlessly across the quiet courtyard. He stepped closer, taking the jacket from my hands, only to shake it out with a sharp snap of leather. Before I could protest, he moved behind me and settled the heavy weight of it over my shoulders. It engulfed me, warm and incredibly soft on the inside, instantly cocooning me in his heat. "Keep it. You're shivering, and I run hot. Besides," he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that shivered down my spine, "it looks better on you than it ever did on me." I wanted to shrug it off. I wanted to tell him that wearing the Alpha's jacket was a statement I wasn't ready to make, a declaration of territory that would paint a target on my back. But the warmth was intoxicating, and the smell of him was so concentrated it made my knees weak. He buttoned the front with deft, gentle fingers, his knuckles brushing my chin, sealing me inside his scent. "Go eat," he commanded softly, tapping me under the chin. "I'll see you later." I turned and fled, unable to handle the intensity of his focus. But as I walked back through the main pack house toward the dining hall, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The change was immediate and terrifying. Usually I was invisible, the quiet healer who slipped through the crowds unnoticed. Now people stopped. Conversations died. Wolves turned their heads, nostrils flaring as they caught the scent of the Alpha King radiating off me in waves. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, giving me a wide berth. I wasn't just Mara the healer anymore. I was walking around wrapped in Kieran's protection, draped in his scent like a banner. I kept my head down, chest with the lapels of the jacket, trying to make myself small, but the heavy leather felt like armor. It was a shield, warding off the casual bumps and jostles of the pack, forcing everyone to acknowledge that the Alpha had placed his mark on me, even if he hadn't bitten me. I was almost to the dining hall doors when a shadow blocked my path. I looked up to find a tall, striking female blocking the way. She was a warrior, known for her ambition and her not-so-subtle attempts to catch Kieran's eye over the years. She looked at the jacket swallowing my frame, her lip curling in a sneer of pure disdain. She stepped into my path, forcing me to stop, and leaned down, her voice dripping with venom. "You look ridiculous," she spat, her eyes flashing with jealousy. "Do you really think playing dress-up makes you special? He's just bored." Healer. Once he's tired of his little game, he'll want a real wolf, not a glorified nursemaid. You should take that off before you embarrass yourself further. My heart hammered against my ribs. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to tell her I didn't ask for this. But the words died in my throat as a sudden, oppressive darkness swallowed the hallway. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in a second. The female's sneer faltered, her eyes widening as she looked over my shoulder. I didn't have to turn around to know who was there. I could feel him, a massive, looming heat at my back, a presence so terrifyingly dominant that the air itself seemed to thicken. A hand settled on my shoulder, heavy and possessing, thumb rubbing soothing circles into the leather of the jacket he had given me. Kieran's voice came from the shadows, low and lethal, a growl that promised violence. "Careful," he murmured, the word vibrating through my body as he pulled me back against his hard chest. "She's wearing my coat, and I don't take kindly to anyone speaking to her in that tone." Chapter 5. The Alpha's Shadow. The confrontation in the hallway had drained the adrenaline from my system, leaving me with a trembling sort of exhaustion, but Kieran gave me no time to recover. His hand remained a heavy, grounding weight on my shoulder, steering me away from the retreating back of the warrior female and toward the double doors of the great hall. The noise from inside washed over us, the clatter of silverware, the roar of 100 conversations, the raucous energy of a pack at rest. Usually, this wall of sound was my cue to slip away to the kitchens or grab a plate and retreat to the quietest corner I could find, disappearing into the background where I felt safest. I automatically angled my body toward the far end of the room, toward the shadows where the lower-ranking wolves ate. But Kieran's grip tightened imperceptibly, halting my escape before it began. "Not there," he murmured, his voice a low rumble near my ear that only I could hear. He didn't look at me. His golden gaze was sweeping the room, assessing the mood, checking for threats, acting the part of the king. "Tonight, you sit with me." My heart leaped into my throat. The head table was elevated, a dais that overlooked the entire pack. It was reserved for the Alpha, his Beta, and the highest-ranking advisors. No one else sat there. Certainly not the pack healer, who spent her days wrapping sprained ankles and dispensing herbal teas. I tried to protest, to dig my heels into the stone floor, but he was already moving, and his arm around my back was an iron bar wrapped in velvet. I had no choice but to move with him, swept along by his undeniable momentum. As we stepped onto the dais, the change in the room was instantaneous. It started at the front tables and rippled backward like a wave. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks lowered, heads turned. Within seconds, the chaotic din of the great hall evaporated, replaced by a hush that was heavy with curiosity and shock. I felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes landing on me, dissecting the healer who was suddenly standing at the right hand of the Alpha. I wanted to shrink, to fold in on myself, but Kieran wouldn't allow it. He pulled out the heavy oak chair next to his own, the seat of honor, and waited. It was a gentleman's gesture, weaponized into a public declaration. He wasn't just offering me a seat, he was carving out a space for me at the very top of the hierarchy. I sat, my legs shaking, and Kieran slid the chair in, his hands lingering on my shoulders for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he took his own seat. He didn't address the staring room. He didn't offer an explanation. He simply turned to Jax, who was sitting on his other side, looking thoroughly amused, and began discussing border patrol rotations. To the pack, it looked like business as usual. But under the heavy oak table, a different conversation was happening. Kieran shifted his position, spreading his legs wide until his knee pressed firmly against mine. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate anchor. The contact was a constant, burning point of heat that grounded me, a silent reminder that while he was managing the safety of the entire territory, his focus remained entirely on me. Dinner was served, platters of roasted venison and root vegetables appearing before us, but my stomach was twisted in knots. I pushed a potato around my plate, unable to lift the fork to my mouth. Kieran didn't stop his conversation with his advisors. He continued discussing supply lines and structural repairs, his voice calm and authoritative, but his left hand dropped beneath the table, finding my thigh. He gave a gentle squeeze, his thumb rubbing soothing circles against the fabric of my jeans. The contrast was dizzying. The cold, calculating leader above the table, and the possessive, tactile lover below it. He was multitasking in the most devastating way possible, claiming me in the dark while commanding the light. The meal dragged on, an eternity of sensory overload. I could smell the jealousy in the room, sharp and acidic, mixed with the rich, confusing scent of the alpha next to me. Finally, as the plates were cleared, Kieran turned his full attention back to me. The room was watching, waiting for his next move. He picked up his goblet, took a slow drink, and then leaned in close, invading my personal space until his shoulder brushed mine. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers grazing the sensitive skin of my neck. The intimacy of the gesture in front of the entire pack was shattering. He leaned closer, his lips hovering inches from my ear, and the heat of his body seemed to seep straight into my bones. "You haven't eaten, Mara," he whispered, the sound dark and promising, sending a shiver racing down my spine. "That's a mistake." His hand slid from my neck down to the small of my back, pulling me just an inch closer, sealing my side against his. "You should try to find your appetite. You're going to need your energy for what I have planned." Chapter 6. Trapped in the Dark. The sky broke open an hour after dinner, unleashing a torrent of rain that hammered against the slate roof of the manor like 1,000 angry fists. I had always hated storms. For a wolf with heightened senses, thunder wasn't just a sound, it was a physical assault, a vibration that rattled my teeth and sent spikes of adrenaline shooting through my veins. When the main power grid failed, plunging the entire estate into suffocating darkness, my composure shattered along with the lights. While the rest of the pack howled in excitement at the sudden blackout, treating it like a game, I retreated. I fled the chaos of the main hall and slipped into the library, the one room in the house with heavy velvet drapes and walls lined with enough books to dampen the noise of the apocalypse outside. I curled up in the corner of a massive leather armchair, pulling my knees to my chest and pressing my hands over my ears, trying to block out the relentless booming from above. The room was pitch black, the silence broken only by my own ragged breathing and the muffled roar of the wind. I didn't hear the heavy oak door creak open. I didn't hear footsteps on the plush carpet. The first sign that I wasn't alone was the scent, that rich, grounding blend of sandalwood and wood smoke that instantly cut through the stale air of the library. It washed over me before he did, a wave of comfort in the dark. Then, A warm, heavy hand settled on my knee, and I jumped, a small gasp escaping my throat. "Easy," Kieran's voice rumbled from the darkness, low and incredibly soft. He wasn't using his alpha voice. He was using the tone one might use to soothe a startled animal. "I wondered where you went. Jax is organising a candle-lit raid on the wine cellar, but I couldn't find my healer." He didn't turn on a flashlight. He didn't need to. I could feel him crouching in front of my chair, his large frame blocking the draft coming from the hallway. He reached out, his fingers finding my hands where they were clamped over my ears, and gently pried them away. He replaced my cold palms with his own warm, calloused hands, cupping my face and running his thumbs over my cheekbones. "You're trembling, Mara. Is it the thunder?" I wanted to lie. I wanted to be the strong, unshakable woman he deserved, not a frightened girl hiding from a storm. But with his thumbs soothing the tension in my jaw and his heat radiating into my shivering body, the lie died on my tongue. "It's too loud," I whispered, the admission feeling like a surrender. "It hurts. I can't filter it out." Kieran didn't laugh. He didn't tell me to toughen up. Instead, he moved. He stood up and began pulling the heavy cushions off the nearby sofas. In the dark, he moved with lethal grace, dragging blankets and pillows toward the corner where the bookshelves met, creating a secluded nook that was sheltered from the windows and the noise. "Come here," he commanded softly, holding out a hand. I took it without thinking, letting him pull me down into the nest of blankets he had constructed. It was primal and deeply intimate, a makeshift den built solely for my comfort. He sat down and pulled me between his legs, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling my back flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his breathing slow and steady, a rhythmic counterpoint to the chaotic storm outside. "Focus on me," he murmured against my skin, his voice a deep vibration that resonated through my spine. "Listen to my heart. Let the rest of it fade away." We stayed like that for hours, wrapped in the dark, insulated by leather-bound books and his possessive embrace. The storm raged on, but Kieran became my shield. Every time the thunder cracked, his arms tightened, grounding me, absorbing the shock before it could reach my nervous system. We talked in hushed whispers, stripping away the titles of alpha and healer until we were just two exhausted souls hiding from the world. He told me about the pressure of the crown, the constant noise of leadership that he couldn't escape, and I realized that he craved the quiet just as much as I did. In the silence of the library, with the rain lashing against the glass, he wasn't the king of the north. He was just a man seeking sanctuary, and he had found it in me. Eventually, the adrenaline faded, replaced by a heavy, syrupy exhaustion. The heat of his body was a narcotic, lulling me into a sense of safety I had never known. My eyelids grew heavy, and I let myself drift, my head falling back against his shoulder. His heartbeat, the last thing I heard before sleep, claimed me. I didn't dream of storms. I dreamed of golden eyes and warm hands. When I woke, the room was gray with the soft, diffused light of early morning. The storm had passed. I shifted, realizing I was still tangled in the blankets on the library floor. But I wasn't alone. My face was buried in the hollow of a warm throat, my leg thrown over a massive thigh. I froze, the memories of the night rushing back, and slowly lifted my head. Kieran was already awake. He lay on his side, his head propped up on one hand, watching me. His golden eyes were clear, alert, and filled with a dark, terrifying intensity that made my breath hitch. He wasn't smiling. He looked like a dragon guarding its hoard, and the moment our eyes met, his gaze dropped to my lips, heavy with intent. "Good morning," he rasped, his voice rough with sleep and something far more dangerous. "Don't move. I've been waiting hours for you to wake up, so I could do this." Chapter 7. The Pull. I scrambled backward before his lips could graze mine, my heart performing a frantic, terrified gymnastics routine in my chest. The intimacy of the library, the nest of blankets, the way his heavy thigh had been thrown over my legs, it all crashed down on me the moment sunlight hit the floorboards. In the dark, wrapped in the storm, we had just been Kieran and Mara. But in the cold, gray light of morning, the hierarchy reasserted itself with brutal clarity. He was the Alpha King, a man destined for a warrior queen, or a political match that would strengthen the territory. I was the pack healer, a woman who preferred silence to power, whose wolf was more likely to hide under a porch than lead a hunt. The idea that he had been waiting hours just to kiss me felt like a beautiful, dangerous lie my brain had concocted to break my heart. I muttered a disjointed apology, untangled myself from the blankets with none of the grace he possessed, and fled the room before he could say another word, leaving him sitting in the pile of cushions with a dark, unreadable expression on his face. The rest of the day was an exercise in self-deception. I buried myself in work, scrubbing counters that were already clean and reorganizing the inventory of dried herbs until my hand smelled of sage and denial. I convinced myself that last night had been an anomaly, a byproduct of the storm and the adrenaline. He had been protective because that was his instinct. I had been needy because I was frightened. That was all. I repeated this mantra like a prayer as I moved through the infirmary, trying to ignore the way every shadow looked like him, trying to pretend that my skin didn't still burn where he had touched me. I avoided the main hall. I avoided the courtyard. I moved like a ghost, sticking to the service corridors and the back rooms, terrified that if I saw him, the fragile walls I was building around my heart would crumble into dust. By late afternoon, I thought I had succeeded. The infirmary was quiet, the patients discharged, and the sun was dipping below the mountain peaks. I grabbed a stack of fresh linens and headed for the supply closet at the far end of the hall, intending to restock the shelves and then go home to my small, quiet cottage at the edge of the estate. I opened the narrow door, stepped into the dim, cedar-scented space, and reached up to place the sheets on the top shelf. The door clicked shut behind me. I froze. I hadn't touched the handle. The air in the closet changed instantly. The smell of cedar and clean cotton was violently shoved aside by the rich, heavy scent of sandalwood and wood smoke. It filled the small space, suffocating and intoxicating all at once. I spun around, clutching the sheets to my chest like a shield, and found my back pressing against the wooden shelving. Kieran was there. He took up almost the entire closet, his broad shoulders brushing the shelves on either side, his head nearly touching the doorframe. He wasn't smiling. The playful, charming male from the exam room was gone. The gentle protector from the library was absent. This was the predator who had been denied his prize. His golden eyes were dark, pupils blown wide, fixed on my face with a hunger that made my knees buckle. "You're fast," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated through the floor and up into my legs. "For a healer, you move like a scout. I've been tracking your scent all day, Mara. You've been avoiding the main corridors. You skipped lunch. You took the servants' stairs to avoid the lobby. You are running." He took a step forward, eliminating the scant 2 feet of distance between us. I pressed harder against the shelves, the wood digging into my spine, but there was nowhere to go. He placed a hand on the shelf next to my head, boxing me in, leaning down until his face was level with mine. The heat radiating off him was immense, a physical weight that pressed against my skin. "I'm not running," I lied, my voice breathless and thin. "I'm working. This is my job, Kieran. I can't spend the day building blanket forts. Reality doesn't stop just because the power went out." I tried to sound rational, tried to sound like the sensible professional I prided myself on being, but my heart was betraying me, hammering a traitorous rhythm against my ribs that I knew he could hear. I looked at his chest, refusing to meet his eyes, terrified that one look would shatter my resolve. "Last night it was just the storm. We were both tired. It doesn't mean anything." Kieran made a sound deep in his throat, a growl of pure frustration. He moved his hand from the shelf to my waist, his grip firm and possessive, pulling me away from the wall and crashing me against his hard body. The towels dropped from my hands, forgotten. "Look at me," he commanded, the order vibrating against my stomach. I looked up, helpless to resist, and saw a raw, naked intensity in his gaze that stole the breath from my lungs. "You think that was just the storm? You think I hold anyone else like that? You think I let anyone else see me like that?" He leaned closer, his nose brushing against mine, his breath hot on my lips. "You can try to hide behind your work, Mara. You can try to hide in this closet. But you are lying to yourself. You don't get to retreat, Mara. Not after last night." Chapter 8. The Jealous Growl. The arrival of the delegation from the Southern Alliance was meant to be a diplomatic affair, a polite exchange of treaties and trade agreements, over sparkling wine and canapes. For a healer, it was supposed to be a boring evening of standing near the perimeter, ready in case someone choked on a shrimp or fainted from the stuffiness of the room. I had positioned myself near a potted fern, nursing a glass of water and hoping to remain invisible. But my newfound visibility, as the woman wearing the Alpha's jacket, seemed to have a lingering effect. I wasn't alone for long. A beta male from the visiting pack, a man named Elias, with a charming smile and easy demeanour, drifted toward me. He wasn't aggressive or overwhelming. He was simply polite, asking about the local herbs and complimenting the efficiency of the infirmary, which he had toured earlier. It was a nice, normal conversation, light, airy, and completely devoid of the suffocating intensity that followed Kieran like a storm cloud. I found myself smiling, actually relaxing for the first time in days. Elias made a joke about the humidity in the south, and I laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to cut through the low hum of the reception. That was the mistake. The moment the sound left my throat, the atmosphere in the room shifted so violently it felt like the air pressure had dropped before a tornado. The chatter at the nearby tables died out. The music seemed to fade into the background. The fine hairs on my arms stood up, not from cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming wave of predatory intent that washed over the hall. I didn't have to look to know who it was, but I turned my head anyway. Kieran was standing across the room, flanked by Jax and 2 other advisors. He wasn't looking at the maps being shown to him. He wasn't listening to the Southern Alpha. He was staring directly at Elias, and he was terrifyingly, unnaturally still. This wasn't the loud, booming Alpha who shouted orders. This was the monster under the bed. His face was a mask of cold, lethal indifference, but his eyes were burning with a golden fire that promised violence. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He just watched Elias with the focused, unblinking stare of a wolf deciding exactly which vertebrae to snap first. Elias, sensing the sudden drop in temperature, faltered mid-sentence, his smile withering as he followed my gaze and realized he was being hunted. Panic flared in my chest. If Kieran attacked a diplomat, the alliance would shatter. I saw his hand twitch, his fingers curling into a fist at his side, and I knew I had seconds before he crossed the room and caused an international incident. I didn't think. I moved. I abandoned my water glass on a passing tray and crossed the floor, my heels clicking sharply on the marble. I intercepted Kieran just as he took his first step toward us. I didn't bow, and I didn't ask for permission. I reached out and wrapped both hands around his tense bicep, digging my fingers into the rock-hard muscle. "Alpha," I said, my voice pitched loud enough to be heard, but soft enough to sound like a request rather than a command. "I need you in the hall. Now." I didn't wait for him to agree. I pulled, putting my entire weight into the motion. For a second, he was an immovable object, rooted to the spot by sheer jealousy, his eyes still locked on Elias's throat. Then he blinked, looked down at me, and the murderous haze cleared just enough for him to recognize who was touching him. He let me drag him out of the ballroom, leaving a room full of bewildered dignitaries in our wake. I pulled him down the corridor and into a deserted alcove, spinning around to confront him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Are you insane?" I hissed, my hands shaking as I let go of his arm. "That is a guest, Kieran. You look like you were about to tear his head off because he asked me about medicinal moss. You cannot growl at everyone who speaks to me. You are the Alpha King, not a jealous teenager." Kieran didn't apologize. He didn't look ashamed. He stepped into the alcove, his large frame blocking the exit, casting me in his shadow. He was breathing hard now, the control he had maintained in the ballroom fracturing. He slammed a hand against the wall right next to my head, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty hall. He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply, aggressively, as if trying to scrub Elias's scent from the air and replace it with his own. His body pressed against mine, heavy and hot, pinning me to the wall. When he pulled back, his eyes were wild, stripped of all diplomacy. "I don't care who he is," he growled, the sound vibrating against my chest, raw and possessive. "I saw him look at your mouth. I saw him make you laugh, and I wanted to burn the world down." He grabbed my chin, tilting my face up, forcing me to look at the absolute ruin in his eyes. "You think this is a game? You think I can stand back and watch another male flirt with what belongs to me? You fix this, Mara. You fix it right now. Go back in there and tell him. Tell him you're mine, or I will." Chapter 9. I am not a queen. His command hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. Tell him you're mine. It was the fantasy of every romance novel I had ever read, the possessive claim of a powerful alpha. But in reality, standing in a dimly lit alcove with the sounds of a diplomatic reception fading in the distance, it terrified me. Not because I didn't want it, my wolf was practically howling in triumph, but because I knew what it meant. To be Kieran's meant to be a queen. It meant standing beside the storm, not just weathering it. And as I looked up at him, at the raw, desperate need in his eyes, all my insecurities came rushing to the surface like a tidal wave. I wasn't a warrior. I wasn't a strategist. I was a healer who liked quiet mornings and organized spice racks. I fixed broken things. I didn't rule nations. I pushed against his chest, creating a fraction of space between us, though his heat still enveloped me. "No," I said, my voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. "I won't tell him that, Kieran, because it's not true. I am not yours. You can't just decide that I am because you're jealous." Kieran flinched as if I had struck him, his expression shifting from anger to shock. But I plowed on, the words tumbling out before I could censor them. "Look at me! I am a healer. I hide in libraries during storms. I get migraines from loud noises. I am not built for this, Kieran. I am not built for you. You need a Luna who can stand at the head of an army, someone who can roar back at you. I'm just quiet. I'm nobody." The silence that followed was agonizing. Kieran stepped back, his hand falling from the wall to his side. The aggressive, possessive energy that had fueled him moments ago seemed to drain away, replaced by a profound, aching stillness. He looked at me, really looked at me, not with the hunger of a lover, but with the deep, penetrating gaze of a man who sees everything. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, absorbing my rejection of myself, letting my insecurities hang in the air like smoke. It was worse than if he had yelled. It made me feel small, exposed, and incredibly foolish. Then he moved. He didn't storm off. He took a slow step forward, reaching out to gently take my hands in his. His palms were warm and calloused, engulfing my smaller fingers. He lifted them, turning them over to look at my palms, tracing the lines there with his thumb. "You think strength is volume, Mara?" he asked quietly, his voice devoid of the growl, soft and incredibly sad. "You think because you don't shout, you aren't powerful? Look at what you did in the hallway that first day. I have generals who are terrified to meet my eye. I have enemies who would rather die than challenge me. But you walked up to me, poked me in the chest, and told me to shut up." He raised his eyes to mine, and the intensity there stole my breath. It wasn't the fiery passion of before. It was a steady, burning conviction. You silenced the Alpha King without raising your voice. You calmed the storm because you weren't afraid of it. That isn't weakness, Mara. That is a power I have never seen before. I don't need another warrior. I have plenty of those. I have an army of people who know how to destroy. He squeezed my hands, pulling me a step closer, his golden eyes pleading with me to understand. I need someone who knows how to heal. I need the quiet. I need you. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, hot and sudden. He was dismantling every defense I had built, stripping away the lies I told myself to stay safe. He wasn't asking me to change. He was telling me that the very things I thought made me unworthy were the reasons he wanted me. My breath hitched, a sob catching in my throat. He released one of my hands to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine, closing the distance but not crossing the line. "You don't have to be a queen," he whispered against my skin, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't have to lead armies. You just have to let me love you. That's all I want. Just stop telling me you aren't enough. Because to me, you are the only thing that matters." He pulled back slightly, looking deep into my eyes, and offered a truth that shattered me completely. "You think strength is roaring, Mara. You silenced me without raising your voice. You are the strongest wolf here." Chapter 10. The Mating Fever. The air in the infirmary had changed. It wasn't just the scent of disinfectant and lavender anymore. It was thick, heavy, and charged with a restless energy that made my skin prickle. For 2 days since the incident in the alcove, I had been vibrating with a low-level fever that had nothing to do with the virus. It was the full moon approaching, yes, but it was more than that. It was him. Kieran's words had burrowed into my chest, taking root and blooming into a terrifying hope. You are the strongest wolf here. I tried to focus on my work, counting inventory and organizing patient files. But my hands were shaking. My wolf was pacing in my mind, whining, clawing at the edges of my consciousness, demanding I go to him. Every time the door opened, my heart leaped into my throat, hoping and fearing it would be the alpha. But he had stayed away, giving me the space I claimed I wanted, and the silence was deafening. By nightfall, the fever had turned into a physical ache. My skin felt too tight, my senses dialed up to an excruciating frequency. I could hear the heartbeat of the nurse 3 rooms away. I could smell the damp earth outside, as if I were burying my face in it. I left work early, unable to maintain the facade of functionality. The walk to my cottage was a blur of shadows and moonlight, my body pulling me toward the main house, like a compass needle finding north. I fought it. I forced my feet to carry me to my own front door, locking it behind me with trembling fingers. I stripped off my uniform and stood under a freezing shower, trying to shock my system back into submission. But the cold water only made the heat inside me burn hotter. It was a biological imperative, a primal scream in my blood that demanded proximity to the one creature who could quiet the noise. I dressed in soft, worn cotton, pacing the length of my small living room. I tried to read. I tried to make tea, but every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run to him, to break down his door and demand he make good on the promise in his eyes. The mating pull was no longer a subtle tug. It was a hook in my navel, dragging me toward the alpha's wing. I was losing the battle. I grabbed my keys, my resolve crumbling, when a heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed through the cottage. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a demand. I froze, staring at the wooden door. I didn't need to ask who it was. The scent of sandalwood, rain, and raw masculine desperation was already seeping through the cracks, flooding my small sanctuary. My heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that matched the pounding on the door. I walked toward it, my legs feeling like they didn't belong to me, and unlocked the deadbolt. The door swung open, revealing the storm standing on my porch. Kieran looked wrecked. His hair was disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it for hours. His shirt was unbuttoned at the top, his chest heaving with exertion. But it was his eyes that undid me. They were blown wide, swirling with gold and shadow, stripped of all regal composure. He looked like a man who had been fighting a war against himself and lost. He gripped the doorframe with white-knuckled hands, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He didn't come in. He stayed on the threshold, respecting the boundary of my home, even as his presence filled it completely. "I tried," he rasped, his voice a broken growl that tore through my defences. He looked at me, his gaze sweeping over my damp hair and trembling form, devouring me whole. "I tried to stay away, Mara. I tried to give you time. I walked the perimeter 3 times. I sat in meetings until my ears rang. But the moon. And you." He cut himself off, shaking his head as if dazed. He took a staggering step forward, crossing the threshold, and the air in the room instantly became too thin to breathe. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from my face, trembling slightly. "It hurts," he whispered, the admission raw and terrifying, coming from the strongest man I knew. "Being away from you. It physically hurts. I can't do it anymore." Chapter 11. The Brink of Surrender. The moment Kieran admitted that his restraint caused him physical pain, the last of my defenses crumbled into dust. Seeing the Alpha King, a man who commanded legions and reshaped the politics of the North, standing in my entryway, reduced to a trembling wreck by the simple fact of my absence, broke something open inside me. I didn't think. I just reacted. I reached out and grabbed the lapels of his shirt, dragging him across the threshold. The door slammed shut behind him, with a finality that echoed in my bones, sealing us inside a world that had narrowed down to just the two of us. He didn't hesitate. He crashed into me, his mouth finding mine with a hunger that was starving, desperate, and terrifyingly absolute. It wasn't a gentle kiss. There was no tentative testing of waters, no slow build-up. It was a collision. His lips were hot and demanding, his tongue sweeping into my mouth to claim me with a thoroughness that made my knees buckle. I would have fallen if not for his arms, which wrapped around me like steel bands, lifting me up until my toes barely brushed the floor. He groaned, a deep, vibrating sound against my mouth that I felt in my chest, and walked us backward. We stumbled down the short hallway, heedless of the framed photos we knocked askew, fueled by a frantic, blinding need. The scent of him, wood smoke, rain, and raw male desire, flooded my senses, drowning out the rational part of my brain that tried to warn me about consequences. All that existed was the friction of his body against mine, the rough slide of his hands tangling in my hair, and the fire igniting in my blood. We didn't stop until the back of my legs hit the edge of my mattress. Kieran followed me down, his weight a heavy, glorious blanket that pinned me to the sheets. His hands were everywhere, fumbling with the hem of my shirt, tracing the curve of my waist, gripping my hips to pull me flush against him. The mating fever was a roar in my ears, a biological imperative screaming at me to submit, to bare my neck, to let him claim what the moon had decided was his. I could feel his wolf surfacing, his movements becoming sharper, more instinctual. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin over my pulse point, ready to mark, ready to bind us irrevocably. It felt like destiny. It felt like drowning. And that was why I panicked. The realization hit me like a splash of ice water. This was the fever. This was the moon. This was biology hijacking the man I was falling for. If we did this now, in the heat of a primal haze, would I ever know if he truly wanted me? Or would I spend the rest of my life wondering if I was just the convenient outlet for an alpha's instinct? I needed him, but I needed the man, not just the wolf. I needed to know that the heart beating so frantically against mine chose me, Mara, the quiet healer, and not just a warm body to ride out the full moon. "Stop!" I gasped, the word tearing out of my throat, ragged and breathless. I shoved against his shoulders, fighting the magnetic pull that tried to glue my hands to his skin. "Kieran, stop! Please!" It took a second for the command to penetrate the haze. Kieran froze. His body went rigid, every muscle locking up as he fought the momentum of his own desire. He lifted his head, his chest heaving, his hair falling into his eyes. His gaze was wild, unfocused, the gold swirling with a darkness that scared me. He looked like a man who had been dragged away from water after days in the desert. He didn't pull away, but he stopped moving, his weight still pressing me into the mattress, his hands gripping the sheets by my head. He waited, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps, giving me the space I had asked for, even though it clearly cost him everything. "I can't," I whispered, tears pricking my eyes as I looked up at him. I reached up, my trembling fingers brushing the hair back from his damp forehead. "Not like this. Not just because of the fever. I need to know this is you. I need to know you see me, Kieran. I can't just be a reaction to the moon. I need words. I need you to tell me." Kieran stared down at me, the wildness in his eyes slowly receding, replaced by a clarity that was even more intense. He understood. He saw the fear behind my desire, the insecurity that still lingered despite everything. He released the sheets and framed my face with his hands, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones with a tenderness that made my heart ache. He took a deep, shuddering breath, reining in the beast, and lowered his forehead to rest against mine. "You want words?" he asked, his voice a rough rasp that scraped against my nerves, raw with honesty. He pulled back just enough to lock eyes with me, his gaze burning with a conviction that shattered the last of my doubts. "Fine, I'll give you every damn word in the dictionary, if you let me in." Chapter 12. Make Me. The silence that followed his promise was heavy, not with tension, but with the sheer weight of the truth he was about to spill. Kieran didn't move immediately. He stayed hovering over me, his breathing slowly sinking with mine, the wildness in his eyes settling into a deep, steady burn that was far more devastating than the fever. He shifted his weight, rolling off me not to leave, but to reposition. He sat on the edge of the mattress, his back to me for a moment, his shoulders rising and falling as he gathered the pieces of himself that he usually kept hidden behind walls of command and authority. When he turned back, he didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who had been carrying the world on his back for too long and had finally found a place to set it down. "You think I want you because of the moon?" he asked, his voice low and laced with a grit that scraped against my heart. "Mara, I have been an alpha since I was 20. I have spent every day of my life surrounded by noise, demands, treaties, wars. Everyone who looks at me wants something. They want protection, they want power, they want a piece of the crown. It is a constant, deafening roar inside my head that never stops. I have to be louder than them just to keep the pack from tearing itself apart. I scream, because if I stop, the silence feels like a void I'll never crawl out of." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he brushed his knuckles against my cheek, his touch reverent. "Until you." My breath hitched in my throat. He wasn't just talking about attraction. He was dissecting his soul and laying it bare on my quilt. He moved then, sliding off the bed completely. In a motion that stopped my heart, the Alpha of the North dropped to his knees on the floor between my legs. The shift in perspective was jarring and profoundly intimate. He was looking up at me, placing himself physically beneath me, surrendering the high ground in a way that defied every instinct a wolf possessed. He rested his hands on my thighs, his grip firm but grounding, anchoring him to me as if I were the only solid thing in a spinning universe. "You are the only person who ever looked at the storm and didn't run for cover," he whispered, his golden eyes searching mine with an intensity that made me ache. "You didn't ask for power. You didn't ask for favors. You just asked for peace. When I am with you, the noise stops. The demands fade. For the first time in my life, I don't have to roar to be heard. I can just be." He took a deep, shuddering breath, turning his face to press a kiss against the inside of my knee, a gesture of worship that sent fire racing through my veins. I don't want you because the moon says so. I want you because you are the quiet I've been starving for my entire life. Tears spilled over my lashes, hot and fast. All my fears, all my insecurities about being too plain or too boring evaporated in the heat of his confession. He didn't need a warrior queen to fight his battles. He needed a sanctuary, and I was the only one who could give him that. He looked up again, his expression raw and open, stripped of all defences. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the same dark, challenging curve from the first day we met, but softened now by love. "Do you remember what you said to me?" he murmured, his voice dropping to a husky plea that vibrated through the floorboards. "You told me to be quiet. Well, look at me, Mara. I'm on my knees. I'm quiet. I am done fighting it." He tightened his grip on my thighs, pulling me slightly toward him, offering himself up completely. "So now I'm asking you again, but this time I'm not playing a game. I am begging you." His eyes locked onto mine, burning with absolute surrender. "Make me yours." The air left the room. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had shattered. He was handing me the leash, the crown, and his heart, trusting me not to break them. A fierce, protective swell of emotion rose in my chest, powerful enough to rival any alpha command. I reached out, grabbing him by the collar of his shirt, my fingers twisting in the fabric. I didn't pull away. I pulled him up. "Finally," I whispered, dragging him back into the storm, where we both belonged. Chapter 13. The Claiming. When I pulled Kieran up from the floor, I didn't just pull a man into my arms. I accepted the weight of a crown I had spent my entire life avoiding. He came to me willingly, crashing against my chest with a desperation that erased every boundary we had ever drawn between healer and alpha. There was no hesitation left in him, no calculated restraint to protect my fragile human sensibilities. He kissed me as if I were the oxygen he had been denied for decades, deep and consuming, his hands tangling in my hair to anchor my face to his. I met him with equal force, my fingers digging into the hard muscles of his shoulders, realizing with a jolt of absolute clarity that he was right. I wasn't fragile. I was the shore that could withstand the crashing of his waves, the only thing solid enough to hold him without breaking. We moved together in a blur of heated skin and discarded clothing, the physical barriers between us falling away to reveal the raw truth of who we were. Seeing Kieran bare was like looking at a map of his history. His skin was a landscape of scars from battles fought and won, a testament to the violence he kept at bay so others could sleep soundly. But when his hands moved over me, tracing the curve of my hip and the line of my spine, they didn't possess the roughness of a warrior. They were reverent. He touched me with a terrifying tenderness, as if he were handling a rare ancient text that might crumble if he wasn't careful. It was this contrast, the lethal power dormant in his muscles versus the worshipful gentleness of his touch, that finally broke me open. "You are so quiet," he whispered against the skin of my throat, his voice rough with emotion as he pressed me back into the pillows. "Even your heart, it beats like a lullaby. It calms everything inside me." He didn't wait for a response. He moved over me, his weight settling between my thighs, heavy and grounding, pressing me into the mattress until I felt printed into the very fibres of the bed. The intimacy was suffocating in the most beautiful way possible. it wasn't just friction and heat. It was a conversation spoken in sighs and the brush of skin, a desperate language of belonging. Every touch claimed a piece of me, not to own, but to cherish. I looked up into his eyes, watching the gold swirl with a darkening desire, and saw no dominance there, only a profound, naked vulnerability. He was entrusting me with his control, letting me set the pace, letting me be the one to guide the storm. The moment we joined, the world narrowed down to the sound of our breathing and the frantic rhythm of our hearts beating in sync. It was an electric slide of sensation that stole the breath from my lungs, a feeling of rightness so profound it brought fresh tears to my eyes. The mating fever that had plagued us for days suddenly crystallized into something sharp and brilliant. It wasn't a haze anymore, it was a tether. I could feel the edges of his soul brushing against mine, a vast, chaotic ocean of energy seeking a harbor. The urge to complete the bond, to seal it with the ancient magic of our kind, rose up in both of us, undeniable and ancient. Kieran froze above me, his chest heaving, his forehead resting against mine as he fought the instinct to bite, waiting for my signal, waiting for me to choose this life, this burden, this love. I didn't tremble. I didn't hesitate. I reached up, my hand sliding around to the back of his neck, my fingers weaving into the thick hair there. I pulled him down, baring my throat to him, offering him the most vulnerable part of myself. "Do it," I whispered, the command soft but unyielding. "Claim me, Kieran. Make it permanent." He groaned, a sound torn from the very depths of his being, and buried his face in the curve of my neck. The sharp sting of his teeth breaking my skin was followed instantly by a flood of warmth that had nothing to do with pain. It was light. It was liquid gold pouring into my veins, knitting our souls together in a knot that could never be untied. I gasped, arching into him as the bond snapped into place, a sudden glorious expansion of my own consciousness. I could feel him, not just his body, but his joy, his relief, and the overwhelming tidal wave of his love for me. We collapsed together, tangled in the sheets, breathing the same air, sharing the same heartbeat. The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect, peaceful bubble that held us safe. But then it rippled. From outside the cottage, rolling down from the main house and echoing off the mountain peaks, a sound shattered the night. It started as a single howl, then another, until the entire valley was filled with the song of the pack. They didn't know the details, but they felt the shift in the earth. They felt their alpha find his anchor. The collective howl rose to a crescendo, a wild, celebratory anthem, acknowledging that the king was no longer alone. And for the first time in my life, the noise didn't scare me. It welcomed me. Chapter 14. The Morning After. Panic. The morning sun hit my eyelids with the subtle persistence of a wake-up call I wasn't ready to answer. I tried to burrow deeper into the warmth beside me, my body feeling heavy, languid, and completely boneless, like I had been melted down and poured back into a new shape. For a few blissful minutes, I floated in that hazy space between dreams and wakefulness, aware only of the solid wall of heat pressed against my back and the heavy arm draped possessively over my waist. The scent of sandalwood and wood smoke was everywhere, in the sheets, in my hair, in every breath I took. It was the most peaceful I had ever felt. Then I shifted slightly, and the dull, throbbing ache in the curve of my neck sent a jolt of electricity straight to my brain. Memory crashed into me with the force of a landslide. the cottage, the fever, the floor, the bite. My eyes snapped open. I lay perfectly still, my heart kicking into a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with sheer, unadulterated terror. I carefully lifted my hand, my fingers trembling as they brushed the sensitive skin where my shoulder met my neck. The skin was raised, hot to the touch, and exquisitely tender. The mating mark. It wasn't a dream. I hadn't imagined the golden light or the feeling of our souls knitting together. I had let Kieran Blackwood, the Alpha King, claim me. I had let him bind his life to mine. And while my heart was singing a joyous anthem of belonging, my logical brain was currently screaming that I had made a catastrophic error in judgment. I was a healer who hyperventilated in crowds. I was the woman who hid in linen closets. And now, I was the alpha female. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at my throat. I looked over my shoulder at Kieran. He was sound asleep, his face buried in the pillow, his dark hair a chaotic mess that made my fingers itch to smooth it down. In sleep, the lines of command were smoothed from his forehead, leaving him looking younger, softer, and heartbreakingly human. I loved him. The force of that love was a physical weight in my chest, undeniable and overwhelming. But loving him and ruling beside him were two very different things. The pack expected a warrior queen, a diplomat, a figurehead of strength. They woke up this morning to find out their king had tethered himself to the woman who organized the herbal tea inventory by alphabet. I felt like a fraud, an imposter who had snuck into the castle under the cover of darkness. I needed to think. I needed a moment of normalcy to recalibrate my world before the avalanche of responsibility buried me. I needed to be just Mara for one more hour. Slowly, with the stealth of a thief, I tried to extract myself from his grip. Kieran grumbled in his sleep, a low, possessive rumble deep in his chest, and tightened his arm reflexively, pulling me back against him. My breath hitched. I waited, freezing until his breathing leveled out again, then tried once more. It took 10 agonizing minutes to slide out from under the weight of his limbs without waking him. I stood by the bed, shivering in the morning air, looking down at him. Even asleep, he took up so much space. I felt a tug in the back of my mind, a golden, humming thread that connected us. It was the bond. I could feel his contentment, a warm, syrupy sensation that tried to lull me back into bed, but I resisted. I dressed in silence, bypassing the soft clothes I had worn yesterday and reaching for my uniform. The crisp white scrubs felt like armor. They were familiar. They were safe. They told the world I had a job, a function, a purpose that didn't involve thrones or treaties. I grabbed my keys and slipped out of the cottage, the morning air biting at my cheeks. The walk to the main house was surreal. The estate felt different, sharper, more vibrant. I could hear the wind moving through the trees with a clarity I had never possessed before. The bond in my mind whispered constantly, a low-level static of Kieran, 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 reminding me that I was merely stretching a rubber band that would eventually snap me back to his side. I reached the infirmary breathless, desperate for the mundane routine of my old life. I wanted the smell of antiseptic. I wanted to check charts. I wanted to be the boss of my little domain where the only thing I had to rule was a schedule. I pushed open the double doors, expecting to find Lena stocking the cabinets, or Jax complaining about a hangover. I stepped inside, a smile already forming on my lips, ready to launch into a speech about being late. The room was full. Lena was there, along with the 2 night shift nurses and a handful of patients waiting for morning rounds. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the bustle stopped. Dead silence fell over the room. I froze, my hand still on the door handle, my smile faltering. "Good morning?" I tried, my voice coming out as a squeak. "I know I'm late, The sentence died in my throat. Lena didn't roll her eyes. She didn't make a joke. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the stack of files she was holding. She stepped back, clearing the path in front of me, and tilted her head to the side, baring her neck in a profound, submissive bow. The others followed suit, a ripple of lowered heads and exposed throats. They weren't looking at Mara the healer anymore. They were bowing to the Queen. Chapter 15. The Public Roar. "Please stop," I begged, my voice cracking under the weight of the sudden, crushing silence in the room. I took a step back, bumping into the doorframe, my hands raising instinctively as if to physically ward off the respect being thrown at me. "Lena, get up! Jax, stop it! I am just Mara. I'm just here to check the inventory." But they didn't move. They remained with their heads bowed, their necks exposed in a display of submission that made my skin crawl. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate the gesture. It was that it felt unearned. I hadn't led armies. I hadn't negotiated treaties. I had simply slept with the Alpha and woken up with a mark on my neck. The imposter syndrome was choking me, making the air in the infirmary feel thin and insufficient. Then, the sensation hit me. A warm, golden pull in the center of my chest that tugged me forward, followed immediately by the heavy tread of boots in the hallway. The staff didn't need to look up to know who was coming. The change in atmospheric pressure was enough. Kieran appeared in the doorway behind me. He hadn't bothered to button his shirt all the way up, and his hair was still damp from a shower. But the power radiating off him was absolute. He didn't look at the bowing staff. His golden eyes locked onto me, burning with a mixture of relief and possessive intensity. He stepped into my personal space, wrapping an arm around my waist and pulling me back against his chest, grounding me instantly. The bond between us flared, a hum of satisfaction settling in my mind now that we were physically touching again. "You left," he murmured into my hair, his voice a low vibration that traveled through my spine. He wasn't angry, but there was a tightness in his tone that told me my disappearance had panicked his wolf. "I woke up reaching for you, and all I found was cold sheets. Do not do that again, Mara." He turned me in his arms, ignoring the audience, his thumb tracing the fresh bite mark on my neck. The contact sent a shiver of pure heat through me, chasing away the cold panic. "Why are you hiding in here? You have a palace, yet you ran back to the supply closet." "I'm not hiding," I lied, though my trembling voice betrayed me. I gripped his forearms, looking up at him with wide, desperate eyes. "I'm working. This is who I am, Kieran. I heal people. I organize shelves. I don't know how to be what they think I am. Look at them. They're terrified of me because of you. I can't lead them. I can barely lead a stretching class." I gestured helplessly to the room of bowed heads. "I'm just the quiet one. Remember?" Kieran's expression softened, the fierce alpha edge melting into something profoundly tender. He took my face in his hands, forcing me to look at him, to see the absolute certainty in his gaze. "They aren't bowing because they are afraid of me, Mara. They are bowing because they can feel what you are to this pack. You are the balance. You are the calm in the center of the storm, and I am not going to let you hide that light under a basket of bandages." He kissed my forehead, a lingering seal of promise, and then turned, keeping his arm firmly around my waist. "Come with me." He didn't give me a choice. He walked me out of the infirmary, not dragging me but guiding me with an unyielding pressure that told me arguing was futile. We walked through the corridors, and everywhere we went, the reaction was the same: silence, respect, awe. We reached the heavy double doors that led to the main balcony overlooking the courtyard. I could hear the murmur of the crowd outside. Hundreds of wolves gathered, sensing the shift in leadership, waiting for the official word. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried to dig my heels in, panic flaring again. "Kieran, I can't. I don't have a speech.
I don't know what to say."
"You don't have to say anything," he promised, kicking the doors open. The sunlight blinded me for a second, and the roar of the crowd washed over us, a chaotic wall of sound that usually made me flinch. But Kieran was there. He stepped out first, pulling me to his side, his presence a shield against the noise. The moment the pack saw us, the cheering stopped. It didn't fade. It was cut off, replaced by a hush of anticipation. Kieran looked out over his people, his hand gripping mine tight enough to bruise, but I squeezed back just as hard. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply raised our joined hands. "You have known my roar." His voice carried effortlessly over the silent courtyard, deep and resonant. "You have followed my command. But a pack cannot survive on noise alone." He turned to look at me, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. The love in his eyes was naked, visible to every wolf watching. "This is my silence," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. "This is the peace I have sought. She is not just my mate. She is your queen. Her voice is the only one that can quiet mine." The weight of his words settled over the crowd, a heavy, solemn truth. He wasn't just claiming me. He was sharing his power. He was telling them that the woman who healed their wounds was now the woman who held their alpha's leash. He turned his body toward me, blocking out the crowd, his golden eyes challenging me, pushing me, believing in me more than I believed in myself. He leaned down, his lips brushing my ear, and whispered the words that would change everything. "They are waiting, Mara. Stop hiding. Give them an order. Show them." Chapter 16. The Voice of the Queen. The silence stretched out before me, vast and terrifying, a canyon I was expected to fill with a voice that had always been too small for this world. Kieran's challenge hung in the air between us, a heavy velvet weight against my skin. "Give them an order." My fingers gripped the stone railing of the balcony until my knuckles turned white, the rough grit biting into my palms, grounding me in the physical reality of the moment. Below, the sea of upturned faces waited. I saw the expectation in their eyes, the ingrained need for direction, the hunger for a leader who would tell them where to stand and who to fight. But when I opened my mouth to shout, to mimic the thunderous authority I had heard Kieran wield 1,000 times, my throat closed up. I wasn't a general. I couldn't fake the roar of a predator. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, tuning out the pressure of the crown and tuning in to the frequency I knew best. I let my senses expand, sweeping over the courtyard, not as a ruler inspecting troops, but as a healer assessing patience. The picture shifted instantly. I didn't see an army anymore. I saw a young scout near the fountain, shifting his weight off a bandaged ankle that was clearly still throbbing. I saw the dark circles under the eyes of the perimeter guards who had been running double shifts since the diplomatic summit. I smelled the acrid tang of exhaustion radiating off the front lines, the subtle tremors of muscles pushed past their breaking point. Kieran led them with fire and iron, driving them to be the strongest pack in the north, but iron brittle if it isn't allowed to cool. They didn't need a war cry. They needed permission to breathe. I stepped forward, releasing Kieran's hand, not to leave him, but to stand on my own 2 feet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't puff out my chest. I simply spoke into the stillness, pitching my tone the way I did in the infirmary when a patient was panicking. Calm, steady, and brooking no argument. "The Western Perimeter Guard is dismissed," I said, my voice carrying over the stone courtyard with a clarity that surprised me. "Rotation 3, you have been on duty for 18 hours. Go home. Sleep. If I see any of you on the training grounds before sunrise, you will answer to me." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The wolves stared at me, stunned. An alpha never ordered rest. An alpha ordered readiness. They looked confused, their eyes darting to Kieran, waiting for him to countermand the order, to laugh at the soft-hearted heather who didn't understand the grim necessity of defense. But Kieran stood like a statue at my shoulder, his face a mask of lethal seriousness, his silence a ringing endorsement of my command. He crossed his arms, his golden eyes sweeping the crowd, daring anyone to hesitate. Slowly, the tension in the courtyard broke. The young scout I had noticed let out a breath that was audible from the balcony, his shoulders slumping in relief. A ripple of movement started at the back and surged forward as the guards realized the order was real. Men and women who looked ready to collapse turned toward the barracks, their steps lighter, the heavy atmosphere of the gathering dissolving into gratitude. It wasn't a chaotic dismissal. It was an organized retreat into recovery. I watched them go, realizing with a jolt of shock that they hadn't listened because I terrified them. They had listened because I had seen what they needed before they even knew to ask for it. I turned back to Kieran, my heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, expecting him to critique my softness. I expected him to tell me that showing mercy was a weakness, that I had exposed our underbelly to the world. Instead, I found him watching me with an expression that stole the breath from my lungs. He looked at me with a reverence that bordered on worship, his golden eyes shining with a pride so fierce it felt like a physical caress. He reached out, pulling me away from the railing and into the shelter of his body, wrapping his arms around me to block out the world. I spent 10 years trying to make them strong, by pushing them until they broke. He murmured into my hair, his voice rough with emotion. He rested his chin on the top of my head, holding me as if I were the rarest thing he had ever found. I thought leadership was about how loud you could scream. But look at them, Mara. He turned me slightly, so I could see the last of the weary guards disappearing into the barracks, the courtyard now peaceful and quiet. You stopped the noise without raising a hand. They didn't need another general. They didn't need more noise. They needed you. Chapter 17. Epilogue. The Silence. The seasons turned slowly in the mountains, the biting frost of winter giving way to the soft, verdant promise of spring. And with the change in weather came a shift in the soul of the Crestwood estate. 3 months ago, this house had been a fortress of noise and tension, a place where doors were slammed and orders were barked across crowded hallways. Now, the silence I had once fought so hard to find seemed to be woven into the very tapestries. It wasn't the silence of emptiness or fear, but the deep, resonant quiet of a home that was finally at peace. I sat propped up against the headboard of the massive mahogany bed that was no longer just the Alpha's, but ours, listening to the wind whisper through the open balcony doors. The estate was sleeping, the pack resting under the new rotation schedules I had implemented, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a healer hiding in the shadows. I felt like the hearth fire that kept the shadows at bay. The heavy door to the bedroom creaked open, breaking my reverie, and Kieran stepped inside. He looked like he had wrestled a mountain and lost. His tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck, and his shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, revealing skin flushed with frustration. He didn't even see me at first. He was too busy pacing the length of the room, running a hand through his already chaotic hair, muttering a low, continuous stream of complaints about the Council of Elders and their inability to understand simple logistics. He was a storm in a jar, vibrating with the residual energy of command, bringing the noise of the outside world into our sanctuary. In the past, I would have shrunk back, letting him burn himself out. Now I simply marked the page of my book and set it on the nightstand, watching him prowl with a small, knowing smile. He finally stopped at the foot of the bed, gripping the wooden post until his knuckles turned white, and looked at me with wild, golden eyes. He opened his mouth to launch into a tirade about the southern trade routes, his chest heaving with the need to roar, to vent, to be the alpha king who demanded the world listen. He looked magnificent in his agitation, a creature of pure power and instinct. But he was also exhausted. I could see the lines of fatigue etched around his eyes, the tension held tight in his jaw. He didn't need to rant. He needed to stop. He needed the one thing only I could give him. I didn't speak. I didn't offer a solution to the trade route problem or ask him about his day. I simply threw back the heavy duvet, patting the empty space beside me. The gesture was small, domestic, and utterly commanding. Kieran paused, his mouth snapping shut with an audible click. The fire in his eyes didn't go out, but it changed, softening from the harsh glare of leadership to the warm, molten gold of a mate coming home. He let out a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate his entire frame, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders as he kicked off his heavy boots. He shed the rest of his clothes with careless efficiency, leaving the armor of the king on the floor, and climbed into bed, moving with the heavy, deliberate grace of a predator seeking its den. He didn't just lie down, he collapsed onto me. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me flush against his hard, warm body. The scent of him, wood smoke, rain, and the crisp night air enveloped me, triggering the mating bond to hum with a contented, purring vibration in the back of my mind. He was heavy, his weight pressing me into the mattress. But I held him effortlessly, running my fingers through his dark hair, scratching lightly at his scalp the way I knew he loved. He let out a groan that vibrated against my collarbone, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. But the silence didn't last long. His mind was still racing, and he lifted his head, opening his mouth to grumble about a meeting scheduled for dawn. I didn't let him finish. I moved my hand from his hair and pressed my index finger gently but firmly against his lips, sealing the words inside. It was the same gesture I had used in the hallway 3 months ago, the same reckless challenge that had started it all. But the context had shifted entirely. I wasn't silencing a stranger. I was quieting my soulmate. Kieran froze, his eyes locking onto mine, the gold swirling with a deep, abiding love. He didn't pull away. He didn't fight for the last word. He simply surrendered, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he accepted the peace I offered. He kissed my finger, smiled against my skin, and for the rest of the night, the Alpha King didn't make a sound. And just like that, the storm finally found its peace. Thank you so much for spending this time with us at Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. If Kieran and Mara's story captured your heart, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps our pack grow stronger every single day, and I don't want you to miss the next love story we have waiting for you. I read every single comment, so please tell me below, what was your favorite moment? Was it the scene in the library during the storm? Or the moment she finally claimed her crown on the balcony? And as always, don't forget to let me know where you're listening from tonight. I love seeing how far our stories travel around the world. Until the next full moon, take care of yourselves.